and welcome to another session of AP Human Geography with Mr. Elrod. We're continuing on in Unit 3, and today we're going to begin a series of discussions on the concept of identification. So basically what we're going to be looking at over the next couple of videos is with culture, and if you've thought about culture and the way we've talked about culture, culture and the things that we participate in culture help us to identify ourselves, help us to identify a group that we belong to, and help us to really understand who we are and kind of what our place is within society as a whole. And it kind of gives us some direction. Again, it helps us to fit in with groups of people, helps us to know what we are and are not supposed to do. And so as we move forward in our world and in time, things have become a little bit more complicated over time, because it used to be historically that it was pretty well accepted that you were born into certain roles, whether it was gender role, ethnic role, racial role, whatever. There wasn't really a whole lot of questioning of that, and you kind of went along with that. Otherwise, you might have been ostracized from society. As we move forward in time, there's a lot of questioning of what we've done in the past, historically, how people have gotten along, how people have identified themselves, the choices that people can make today in terms of their identification, what it means for them, are starting to make things a bit more complicated. Now, this is not necessarily taking place all over the world, but certainly in some parts of the world, it's going to have major ramifications for us in terms of society, how we interact with each other, how do people deal with overcoming some of the emotions that they feel, especially if they feel strongly against some of these movements that are taking place. We'll get more into that later. Anyway, so again, this idea of identification. So we're really just going to go over three different ways, really, that a lot of times we might either identify ourselves, or historically we have been identified for us. So we're going to talk about ethnicity, we're going to talk about race and gender. First, we're going to talk about ethnicity, and that's what we're going to be dealing with today. And again, we look at things like, does it inform my role in society, how I'm supposed to behave in terms of correct behavior, incorrect behavior, who I interact with in terms of who I'm allowed to interact with, who am I not allowed to interact with, what is considered acceptable social interaction, what profession I'm allowed to or not allowed to have, the amount of money that I make, all those types of things. And as we look through all of those, what we have to understand is this is going to change kind of geographically as we move across space. I will talk more about that in a little bit. It's going to change within different societies, and we'll talk about, is that because of culture? Is that because of elements of culture? Is that because of levels of development? Why is that the case? And in each of these, historically we would have found that, really either your ethnicity or your race. Ethnicity is kind of newer these days. We typically used to talk about race historically, and gender. It determined a lot of these things for you. Of course, today in our world, things have changed a lot and progressed a lot, and so this doesn't play as much of a role, especially in the more developed countries. It might play a role in some less developed countries in some specific instances, but for the most part, these things really don't matter anymore. Again, maybe with some exceptions in some specific instances we can point out. So again, when we talk about identification, it's either personal identification or social identification. These are a lot of the things that it's going to deal with here in terms of what might inform for us. So we talk about what ethnicity is. So basically, ethnicity is going to be a self-imposed set of rules in which people believe that they share, they either do or perceive that they share certain cultural traits. So really what we're looking at, ethnicity is really wrapped up into culture. And so when people identify themselves with a larger group of people in a common culture, they see themselves really as one group. And so that culture and ethnicity, again, are very closely tied to each other. So they can look at things like language, they can look at history, they can look at their religion, they can look at their nationality. And so again, people will kind of look again across the commonalities to try and come together or bind together as a group. And in terms of ethnicity, it's helped people to again identify themselves, kind of their place in society, help them to bond with other people, kind of feel like they are part of a larger group, which helps them to have a sense of security and move forward in society, because nobody really likes to be alone, unless Paul Simon says that he is a rock. He might be an island, but for the most part, nobody likes to be alone. They want to know that they identify with a larger group. Now, this was much easier when we talk about ethnicities. The understanding of different ethnic groups. We all understand that across the world, different people participate in different cultures and things like that. So it's been very easy for us to kind of separate historically, geographically, where specific ethnic groups were living. Things are becoming much more difficult today because of globalization, because of increased wealth across the world, which has allowed more people to move across the world, and different ethnic groups are transplanting themselves in different places. And just like when we talked about cultural adaptations or cultural convergence, what happens when these people from different cultures come together and blend their ethnicities or blend their cultures? How exactly do you find that? Probably one of the best examples to use in terms of difficulty today is what does it mean to be an American? And we can have this conversation a lot either in class or academics will have this conversation. What exactly does it mean to be an American? Is it specific cultural traits or is it a set of ideas? What exactly does that mean? But as we move forward in time and as more people are moving around, it actually might become more and more difficult to try and set rules for specific ethnic groups, especially as it becomes more acceptable within societies for these different ethnic groups to get together and create families and then share those cultural traits amongst each other. When we talk about ethnicity, and it's interesting because you actually have seen kind of the world move in almost polar opposite directions. In one sense, people are coming together in much greater numbers. Ethnic groups are combining, and you have kind of this, like I was talking about a second ago, the difficulty in pinpointing the location of ethnic groups. But it's almost like because of that globalization, we've almost driven people to the opposite ends where they, because of a concern for losing their heritage or their culture, or the concern that other cultures will try to somehow harm them, people have been kind of going to their separate corners of the world. And an example of that is within Eastern Europe and the Balkan Peninsula with the breakup of Yugoslavia, and in several other parts of the world, but primarily so in the breakup of Yugoslavia, where in other parts of Eastern Europe, where pretty much every country in Eastern Europe has a set of national boundaries that are created, pretty much specifically for certain groups of people. You think about, you name almost any country. You name Greece, you name Croatia, you name Bosnia, you name, and this is embarrassing, right? So you name Bosnia, you name Slovakia. Who lives in each of those places? The Greeks live in Greece, the Bosnians live in Bosnia, the Croatians live in Croatia, the Slovaks live in Slovakia, the Slovenes live in Slovenia. So anyway, or Slovenia. So it's almost like you have people driven to that extent because they want to create separate countries for themselves so they can kind of determine their own destiny, their own position. This idea of popular sovereignty, championed by Woodrow Wilson after World War One to try and prevent some of the atrocities that happened during World War One, where these people wouldn't be under these larger empires and they would be away from that, so that this ethnic what eventually would become ethnic cleansing would no longer take place. And so people could create their own rules that were kind of specific to their own particular ethnic group. So it's almost like our world is going in two completely different directions. So anyway, again, you look here, you have the breakup of Yugoslavia, and in our class, my class, we'll learn more about the breakup of Yugoslavia in the political unit. But anyway, so it breaks away into each of these different countries, and you see the countries around, Romania, Italy, Macedonia. Again, these are pretty much all, and completely forgot about Serbia, really the instigator of the whole situation. Kosovo just declared its independence a couple of years ago. Each of these are countries that are pretty much wrapped around the identity of a particular ethnic group. And some additional examples that we've seen here in the recent past: Scotland just held a referendum for independence. Catalonia in Spain, the Basque region in Spain, Quebec in Canada. All of these are particular ethnic groups who have a specific history or common ethnicity that's different from the country that they're a part of, and they want to separate and create something entirely new and entirely different. So you see a lot of this in ethnicity playing a role in creating tension in certain parts of the world. Now, a lot of this happens when you have minority groups who feel like they are somehow oppressed or they are somehow mistreated or not necessarily treated fairly or don't get a fair shake within the larger setting. Each of these examples here, Scotland, Catalonia, Basque, Quebec, you had the ethnic cleansing happening in Bosnia, the Serbians, and what they were doing to the people there in the former Yugoslavia. these people don't feel like they're getting a fair shake. They feel like their culture is being kind of squashed, that they don't have an appropriate amount of voice in the national government, and so these are all parts of the conversation. So that's why they want to separate out and create their own countries. Now on larger scales, where you are looking at smaller places, we tend to find that ethnic groups tend to congregate in similar areas. So if you look at this example here, this is of New York City, looking at census tracts, and you notice that pretty much all of the map is shaded one color or another, indicating that each area is made up of a, and this is not ethnic groups. So I guess they call them maybe ethnic groups, but census uses more racial identity. But we find that these groups of people tend to congregate in similar areas, and a lot of people get upset about that, and they might decry that situation and say that we need to come together, whatever. But it's almost a fact of life that we tend to try and group ourselves with people who we are familiar with, who are similar to us, because it makes us feel more comfortable. The appropriate types of services are going to be provided to those particular groups of people. We tend to find somebody, maybe a family member, somebody who's gone before us. Again, we have the services that are available, whether it's churches or stores or whatever, that can provide us with those things. And so that tends to be what happens. Now, there are some examples of where ethnic groups are separated out and forced to live in certain areas. One of those historical examples was called a ghetto. A ghetto is an example of forced space. In ghettos, historically, where Jewish people were forced to live during the medieval period in European cities. And so a ghetto is a specific space set aside for a particular ethnic group, typically found in cities. And so again, this would be an example of forced space. So this would be involuntary, where a particular ethnic group is forced to live within a city. Now, another example of this is what's called an ethnic enclave. Now, the difference between a ghetto, well, not necessarily a ghetto itself, but the ethnic enclave itself, is that the ethnic enclave is surrounded by other groups of people. So an enclave is this idea that it's resting inside something larger than itself, or things that exist around it. And the ethnic enclave kind of has this connotation of conflict. The reason that people are living in those places is because they do not feel safe living outside of their own ethnic neighborhoods. And so again, there is this connotation of tension. There's this connotation of difficulty between the different ethnic groups. And then a ghetto could be an example of an ethnic enclave. Now, another example of ethnic groupings is what's called an ethnic neighborhood. So the ethnic neighborhood, different from the ethnic enclave, would be a connotation not necessarily of conflict, but typically a voluntary move of a particular ethnic group to a specific area within a city or a community. So this is where the different ethnic groups congregate. And we see several of these across the country. You have places like Chinatown in San Francisco, you have Little Italy, in several eastern cities. You have places that are predominantly Irish, predominantly Polish, whatever it happens to be, and they are made up predominantly of groups from that particular, people from that particular ethnic group. So when you look at these ethnic neighborhoods, you want to begin to ask yourself, well, why is it that people choose to move to those places? You look at some situations, maybe they were forced to move to that particular area. Maybe the rules were such that they were not able to purchase property elsewhere. You look at the situation in Belgium, where you have the Dutch and the French speakers, and the fact that the laws are written in such a way that the French might have a harder time buying property in certain parts of Belgium. So that obviously would be a situation where people are forced to do something. Especially in the United States, the reason you tend to have ethnic neighborhoods is because of chain migration. People move to a place where they know somebody else, where they feel comfortable, where they're going to have services provided for them that are familiar to them. They have